More than 30 years have passed since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which included 15 republics, and in this video we'll find out the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1989, the government officially recognized the economic crisis. This period was characterized by the main problem of the Soviet Union, the commodity deficit. There were no goods on free sale except bread. The population was using special coupons for which it was possible to get food. The prerequisites for all this was the decline in world oil prices. This led to the fact that in 2 years the foreign trade turnover decreased by 14 billion rubles. As well as the Chernobyl tragedy seriously hit the economy. Economic growth began to slow down with the advent of Brezhnev's power, and already at the end of his reign it began to stagnate. A huge country held on to the idea of building a bright communist future. The ideals of communism were instilled from birth, and any attempts to think differently were severely suppressed. The Soviet Union was formed by fanatics of the idea. Only ardent revolutionaries and fundamentalists of communism came to power, and there were fewer and fewer of them every year. It's also worth noting that there was an agent of the power elites. The average age of members of the Politburo in recent years was 77 years. Problems also arose in the centralization of power. Everything was solved in Moscow, and therefore it led to such problems. The first is the inhibition of the activities of individual republics. They lack the flexibility to make their own decisions. And secondly, certain regions of a multinational country wanted to develop independently because they had their own culture and their own history. During the Cold War, the entire economy of the USSR was focused on the arms race. And since there was a planned economy, the absolute majority of resources were invested in the development of the country's military potential. In the second half of the 20th century, the USSR participated in dozens of wars, sponsored a considerable number of revolutions, and also regularly helped the countries of the socialist system by supplying them with resources, equipment, and forgiving debts. Also, don't forget about the policy of the Iron Curtain, which isolated the socialist countries from the influence of the West. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, came to power in 1985 with his reforms. He presented two main plans. This is perestroika and glasnost. The essence of perestroika was the transition from socialism to capitalism, only in a smooth, consistent way. China has shown a good example of such a reform. The second part of the plan is publicity, which concerns the personal limitations of the Soviet people. For decades, citizens have lived without freedom of speech, religion, or the press, and the state arrested millions of potential dissidents. Gorbachev's glasnost plan gave Soviet people the right to vote, but Gorbachev's reforms did more to accelerate the fall of the Soviet Union than to save it. Having weakened control over the people and carried out reforms in the political and economic spheres, the Soviet government turned out to be weak and vulnerable to the Soviet people. The fall of the Soviet Union is also linked to the structure of the country itself. The Soviet Union was a country consisting of 15 radically different republics. There were dozens of peoples, languages, and cultures all over the country, and many of which were incompatible with each other. In 1989, nationalist movements in Eastern Europe led to regime change in Poland, and soon a similar movement influenced Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and other post Soviet countries. Many of these former Soviet allies began to be divided along ethnic lines, which only fueled separatist movements in the Soviet Union. Interethnic conflicts have also started in some regions, especially in the Caucasus, where the Karabakh, South Ossetian, and Georgian Abkhaz conflicts began. Although many factors led to the fall of the Soviet Union, historians still continue to analyze internal and external factors.